Can you tell us what's currently going on the battlefield now?
Things seem to have maybe stabilized is the wrong word, but after that very rapid collapse that began, it began before the special operations through the gas pipeline, but it really was accelerated by the special operation. And the Ukrainians were driven out almost entirely out of Kursk, and now they just hold on to a sliver of land. It's basically 2.5 hamlets right there on the border, but that hasn't changed. And I don't know if it's because the Russians have decided to just take a breather and consolidate, and kind of you to actually just firm up their logistical lines, to make sure that they're ready for the next stage. I don't know if it's a decision that was made on the Russian side, or if it's because, as many reports have stated, the Ukrainians have sent many reserves, reinforcements to the area, it seems ridiculous just to hold on to this tiny sliver of land, but it just allows Zelensky to say that he still holds pre-2014 Russian territory, that he still holds on to a little tiny piece of Kursk, and I think that's very important to him. But at some point, I think because we're talking about just a little bit of land in the very near future, either those reinforcements will simply be destroyed. Maybe it'll take a couple of weeks, I don't know, and the Russians will continue to advance. And again, Putin has said that he wants to create a buffer zone in Sumy, so they're going to continue. They're going to cross the border as they've done on the flanks already, and strike deeper into Sumy, and gain control over a piece of Sumy at least. There may be the intention to take all of Sumy somewhere down the road, because it is largely it is a Russian-speaking territory. So that's what's happening or not happening in Sumy Kursk region. And then along the rest of the line, there was a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians launched some counterattacks, and they had some success. And, this happens again, like every couple of months. At some point, the Ukrainians will concentrate forces at some point along the front line and launch a counterattack. Quite often, the attack is repulsed immediately. It fails entirely, but sometimes they do take back a village or part of a village. In this case, they did take at least one village south of Pokrovsk, and then they also went back into Toretsk and took took control over some buildings and city blocks. And now my understanding is that those gains by the Ukrainians have been almost entirely reversed at this point, which I think was inevitable. But yeah, those parts, the Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, seemed not much is happening there. We saw a lot of movement there, in the preceding months, but the Russian advance has slowed there, and it seems to pretty much, for the time being, come to a halt. But this is what we see often. It's just like one part of the line. I think it's just, I don't know if it's in general the Russian strategy, or the broader strategy, I believe, is that they exert pressure along the entire front line, and then when they notice a weakness somewhere, they exploit it and push forward there. And then the Ukrainians are forced to send their reserves there, and then that weakens another part of the line, and then the Russians push forward there. It seems like the Ukrainians have tried to have sent their reinforcements to Pokrovsk and the Toretsk area and Chasiv Yar. But the Russians are finding it much easier to advance farther north. You don't hear about it much in the news, but over the last couple of months, they have taken a lot of land north of Kupiansk, up in the Kharkov region. They cross the Oskol River, and they keep on expanding. First, they said it was a bridgehead. It's a lot more than a bridgehead now, and they are seem to be making a pretty big move there. So there's talk that may be as part of a planned attack on Kupiansk, which again is a city in the Kharkov region. but it also might be something larger. It may be that they're going to, the Russians had that incursion into Kharkov that they launched about a year ago, and they might start driving from that, the piece of territory they took there in the northern part of Kharkov, and then now they're going to come up from the south, from the Kupiansk area, and just take everything there in eastern Kharkov. Again, there's discussion of that. We'll see. It's very hard to predict what the Russians are going to do. But then, they're advancing in the Liman area, which is just south of Kupiansk. And then there have been some pretty significant advances south of, in the Zaporozhye region, heading towards Zaporozhye city. And for a long time, I know military analysts have been looking at that as a possible area for a major Russian offensive, because they do have a lot of reserves in that area. They could put in like a good 150,000 soldiers. I've heard talk about possible major Russian offenses ever since the beginning of this conflict 3 years ago, and it never seems to happen. They seem to just continue. Right. So
it's like the Russians don't seem to do major offenses. It's something that we like to think about, the big punch right through the line. But they play the slow game. Just let's attrit. Let's slowly attrit Ukraine. We minimize our casualties. Our military base keeps on building and growing. Theirs keeps on going down. Why change? And I think,
you're right. And I think, it'll happen at some point, but it'll happen when the Russians think that the Ukrainians have been sufficiently weakened so that they can do these major offensives and grab large, amounts of territory. Instead of, advancing a kilometer in a day, they can advance 10, 20 kilometers in a day and without suffering significant casualties. And they may just feel like the Ukrainians still, they have clearly been weakened, severely weakened, but not to the extent that the Russians can carry out one of these offensives and do it without suffering significant casualties. When those big offensives, they can achieve, great successes, they grab large amounts of territory, but they're always costly. You always lose a lot of men when you do that, because they have to get out in the open and they become vulnerable. It's a lot safer if you stay in your carefully constructed, trenches and bunkers and just pound away at the enemy. And then when you've going to basically pulverized the enemy in front of you, then you move in. When you're sure that there's going to be very little resistance. That's what the Russians have been doing, and they've been making steady advances. And I think really with minimal losses over the last several months. And I think that's going to be the plan. But who knows? There will be that point where I believe, where they make the decision. Now is the time. And maybe that's not too far in the future. Maybe it will be after this Rasputitsa, the mud season ends. It'll be another month or so, but who knows? It could be a year from now. Just because I do always hear about impending offensives, and they never happen. The Russians have stuck with this policy of just pressure all along the front line, and just always pushing forward when there's a weak point, and it's been successful. It's again, it's just they're in a much stronger position. Now, they pretty much started that, you could say, a little bit over a year ago. It was a year ago that they took, a year and a month ago that they took Avdiivka. And they have had a lot of successes since then. And maybe we're just going to see more of the same this year. But then, there's that talk of the collapse. We saw a collapse on a small scale in Kursk. I think that was fair to call that a collapse. That was, it was just crumbled. The Ukrainian defenses crumbled, and they fled in great numbers. And maybe that's just a foretaste of what we're going to see on a much larger scale. I think it is. It's just a question of when. And, that's just really hard to say. It's the when is the most difficult thing to predict.
Yeah, well, when it does happen, it'll be interesting to see how the EU and the US react to this. It's where the rubber meets the road. Or there's going to be panic amongst
Yeah.
all the nation's capitals across Western Europe. They're going to try to send in troops. We'll
Yeah.
see.
Right. And
Well,
again,
Dad,
like I've said, let me just say
go
that
ahead.
quickly. It will be a test for the Trump administration. It's just that, I think it's clear they want to get they just like to be finished with this, get out of this conflict. They don't want to be involved in Ukraine, but it is going to be hard for them to leave if, especially when, as I said before, when the Russian army is marching on Kiev or something. I mean, there's just going to be the din of protest and the howls of outrage are going to be hard to ignore. And it's going to be, and Trump, I think, has a real fear of ever being compared to Biden and what happened in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And they're going to try to blame it on it and say it was weakness and so on. And we'll see. Maybe he'll be able to blow it off. It's very hard to predict Trump, but he might be vulnerable to those kind of criticisms. And he might feel like he's got to go back in, or just the fear of that will keep him from actually pulling out.
That's a scary thought.